Welcome, everybody. We're going to have a very exciting conversation today, and just a crazy setup. We're just trying all kinds of new things. First of all, it's not just a one-on-one on Riverside. It is a two-on-two, and it's spouses. Like, this is just wild. So first, let me just welcome my beautiful wife, Sarah.
Hey there.
Who's part of this. Hey there. Part of that conversation. And our good friends, Andrew and Christian Walker.
Hey
Andrew
there.
is a...
Yes. It's a wife thing, you know?
Oh, it's all this thing. I was worried this thing would slip out of control, and it happened in the first few seconds. I don't even know what to do now. It's unreal. Andrew and Christian have written a terrific book, and I heard about this book months ago, even when it was, I think, in the conceptual phase. I don't know why I heard about it, or I don't know if Andrew, if you and I talked somewhere, maybe at an ADF thing or something like that.
Yeah.
But absolutely love the idea. And part of the reason that we wanted to have this conversation this way, kind of couple to couple, really parents to parents, is, man, the book, the theme of the book, the topic of the book, how you put it together kind of resembles our life. We have 4 children, 3 daughters, Abigail, who is 19, Anna, 17, Allie, 15, and then this 8-year gap, where this little monster showed up, Hunter.
Oh my gosh. Hunter, if you hear this, that was Dad's words, not mine.
Yeah, that's right. And I
Hunter,
said it with
you're
great
loved,
love and
I'm sure.
affection.
You're very loved, Hunter.
Hunter likes being called a monster, for the record.
That's true.
But, I was just thinking how many conversations we've had about stuff we did not plan to have conversations about, and it's different even with our oldest, who's 19, and the conversations we're having with Hunter, and not just because one's a girl and one's a boy, but how much our culture has shifted and moved, and that kind of 12-year kind of period of time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Isn't that
so true.
Yeah. And so, Andrew and Christian, tell us about your kids and your family, because I know a big part of the reason you guys wrote this book was to do it kind of, you're not just, authors, you're also clients, right? You're actually doing this yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've been married. It'll be 18 years this year. And we've got 3 daughters, Caroline, who's 13, Catherine, who is 9, and then our last, Charlotte, who is 6. And so we wanted to write a book that we, as you just said, that we would use ourselves. And so that's what kind of put the inspiration behind doing this book.
Yeah, you know what I love about it, you guys, is that you set it up so that it's for parents to get equipped. And it's very doable. It's not like this huge academic tome of a book. It's like a couple pages on a topic that helps the parents really figure out, okay, how can I think about this from a Christian worldview? And then the questions that you ask on different levels is so helpful, because it just enables you to start a good conversation. Mm-hmm. And I so appreciated that.
Yeah. So Andrew came home, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago from a speaking trip and said, I just keep getting asked, how do I have these conversations with my kids? And he normally talks about sexuality and transgenderism and these big, heavy, weighty topics. And people are always waiting in line after he has talks. How do I have this conversation with my kids? How do I have this conversation with my grandkids? And I said, well, you really need to level this in a more kid-friendly way, but on specific developmental levels. Yeah. And I have a background in elementary education. And so I was thinking through this, and like you said, a 12-year-old is going to hear this very differently than a 6-year-old. And so I said, we can totally do this, because you have the brains for the parents and I have the brains to make this age appropriate. So we can work together on this. And so we sat down right then and kind of sketched out what it would look like to format this book this way. And then that Thanksgiving, we just tried one chapter. We tried the chapter on abortion, and it worked really well. He did his part and I took that and did mine. And I was like, oh my goodness, we can do this. We can totally do this. So,
and we actually worked well as a team. That was kind of the unknown element going into this, is like, we both have our personalities. We both work our certain ways. It's a question of we work well running a home together, raising our kids. We work well independently at the seminary and then in her school. How's that going to work as we do this together?
Yes.
And we each kind of had our individual responsibility for each chapter, and it worked really well. And we actually came out of the book liking the book and also liking each other. So
that's good. Hey, we should write a book together.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe we're not in the same place.
Yeah. Are we a good team?
Well, maybe on all kinds of things, the answer is yes.
Yes.
But another thing that this reveals, and I think the thing that I noticed right away in the book, and then just kind of in our experience, is that your posture towards this is very similar to ours, which is, you've got to telegraph these conversations. You've got to get into these conversations. And I guess I've been surprised at sometimes just to kind of, parents are really afraid, right? Mm-hmm. They don't want to say the wrong thing.
Yes.
And so sometimes they don't say anything at all.
Yes.
And I've just really become convinced that a lot of times to not say something is louder. Mm-hmm. If everybody else in the world is talking about it, but the church, man, you can really give kids the impression, well, I guess the church doesn't have anything to say about this, when we've got the best answer kind of on the market on all these things.
Yeah, that's exceptionally well said. And one of the driving themes that we've been really adamant about with this book, and then just parenting in this culture, is if you aren't discipling your kids actively and intentionally, the culture will definitely disciple your kids for you. And they'll do it with greater effectiveness and greater efficiency. And so what we've tried to do with this book is, not overload the parent with content. So each, as Sarah just mentioned, each chapter is very intentional in trying to think through what are the 5 to 7 most important kind of comprehensive issues in order to understand this issue from a fully biblical perspective, but not, it's not 30 pages per chapter. It's not thousands of words per text. It's something that is meant to be a quick resource that parents can utilize and use at their discretion and their disposal when these conversations need to happen, and to free them for them to understand they actually don't have to be experts in all of these areas.
Yeah.
There's too many chaotic issues in the culture for every parent to be an expert on every issue. So what we try to do in the book is, again, provide that well-rounded resource. And then if parents do want to go deeper, we provide some recommended resources in each chapter as well that gives, again, a deeper dive on all of these various issues.
Well, one thing that we have really tried to do with our own kids is understand that, soldiers don't go to the battlefield without lots of training first. Missionaries don't go to the mission field without lots of training first. And we have to have that mentality with our kids before they go into the culture, which is kind of like a culture war. It's a war with darkness. It's a war with evil. It's a war with culture. And so we have to be intentional in training them in understanding the truth of God's word before they can go out and be exposed to the darkness that's fighting against God's word. And so we have to be the first ones to talk to them about what is happening so that they can be aware of the darkness around them and fight against that.
And one of the things we try to stress in the book is every parent wants to avoid awkwardness. Well, the problem is the culture we live in doesn't allow us to avoid awkwardness. And so it's kind of one of these things where you want to say to someone, all right, you just got to run towards the awkwardness, run towards the weird conversation. Because again, these issues are confronting us actively. You really can't hide from these issues. As one of John and I's friends likes to say, Eric Erickson, he'll use the phrase, you will be made to care. And so the question is, if you're going to be made to care, what are you going to do in response to that inevitability? Are you going to kind of bury your head in the sand, or are you going to actively confront these issues? And John, what you said is exactly right. We wouldn't write this book if we didn't think that the Christian worldview is not only the correct and true worldview, but the worldview that is actually grounded in a better understanding of what it means to be human, and then an understanding of what it means to truly flourish as a human being. And so this is actually an invitation to parents to go on offense, because one of the things I want to tell every Christian audience that I speak to is when you kind of look underneath the hood of secular ideology, there's not a lot there. It's pretty empty. It's pretty vapid. Christianity has far better and far deeper resources. What parents need is to get those resources in a digestible format, which is what we've tried to do in this book.
I want to start on the awkwardness things, because I learned this from Sarah. Like, she has this great phrase that know what I'm talking about?
Yes. I actually just wrote that down. My motto is I'm going to feel awkward about it later.
Yeah,
so not right now. But I want to just dive into something just a little bit further back, Andrew, that you said you don't have to be the expert. And I think parents are intimidated because these issues come up and they're like, I don't know where I even stand on this. And I think one thing that I've learned so much in having kids is that you don't have to have the answer right away, but don't let that I don't know just remain there in the sky. Like, go find out and go do the hard work and learn. And I think one of the ways that I've grown so much in parenting is just staying curious, and your kids see you be curious. And then you just have this ongoing conversation, right? Which is those questions lead to in your book, is just this ongoing conversation. And the beauty of that is that you don't have to have all the answers right away. Like, John is like an Instapot thinker. He's like, I got this. And I'm like, hold on just a second. I'm going to need to go read a couple things. I'm going to need to talk to a few people. And so I'm kind of a crockpot thinker, and that's okay. Like,
yeah, but both of those are okay, right? Like, to me, this gets to a philosophical decision that we've got to make. I don't know if you saw this, but it was like maybe earlier this week, somebody tweeted out, it was one of those invitations on Twitter or X about what's your hot take on parenting. And somebody was like, many parents aren't qualified to homeschool their kids, right?
Oh,
I mean, this was just, that. Did you see that?
Yeah.
And of course, the underlying assumption here is that if you have a degree, suddenly you are qualified to teach a kid. Like, who made that up, right? No, the philosophical discussion here is the most important voice in your kid's life is the parent, period. Oh, and God set it up that way. And it's not because you do have all the answers. It's because no one knows and cares for your kids, like you do. And that's the rule of thumb to go with.
That's why we wanted to write this book kind of this way, was that when you're in the car and you've got a million children in your car and you have a million questions coming at you at one time, you can't not answer the questions. You can't just leave them there.
Like it or not, it's coming. Yeah. You got to do it. Jump in.
You have to answer. And so I wanted this book to be really easily accessible for parents to run inside, grab the book, find the chapter that they asked you about, find the age that you need to answer your questions, and start answering the questions, and then start having the conversation with your kid so that you can quickly defend whatever they're coming at you with. And even if you're not an expert, even if you've never read anything about it, you can quickly just answer that question that they had in the car that they threw at you really fast.
And the other thing that this leads to as well is that we are confident in the truth.
Yes.
So just because we don't have the answer right away doesn't mean there's not an answer. And so when my kids ask me a question and I don't know, I can say, I don't know, let me go do some thinking and reading about that, talk to some people. But I'm not shaken because I know that truth is there and that we can find it together. But that also leads to one other thing, if I could go on for just a second. It's the habits that we form. Because if we ourselves as parents are not being formed and shaped by the gospel and by the church, we aren't going to have the right wisdom and answer for the moment. Wouldn't you guys say?
Yeah. Hey, we got to go here because you threw this out and I don't want to lose this. You said something about awkward conversations. We've got stories of awkward conversations and yes. I feel like you need to tell us a story.
Let's hear it.
Like, was that Thanksgiving conversation super awkward or do you have another one? I mean, what
we
was
have
it?
So many awkward conversations, mostly with our 13-year-old, but I mean, I would say that because I started leaning into those awkward conversations when she was 7 and 8. Now at 13, she comes to me and initiates awkward conversations because I've been so open having them with her. So I think that if I hadn't been open and honest and leaned into the awkwardness for so many years, she might not come to me and ask me anything that she's curious about. And so I think that's really good. I mean,
no, it's huge. It's huge in an age of information. Because think of, this is something that parents miss, right? There are so many different sources out there scrambling for the attention, right? Scrambling for your kids' attention. So I think that's huge. And I don't know why fireworks just went off.
I was going to say.
Did you see that? Carlos, what's that? Is that good? Carlos did it.
Thumbs up and it created
this does it?
Yes.
Something you did.
Oh, no way. That's awesome. Yeah. I'm going to do that a million times. But hey, you're not going to get away with it. You have to tell us an awkward story. Like, tell us an awkward story. This is important.
Wow, you're so demanding.
I am demanding.
Well, I mean, like, one that comes to mind is, okay, do you have one?
I should share it online.
You tell yours. No, you tell yours.
How far and wide is this going to go?
Be discreet. I mean, but yeah, if you need to share it, share it.
I don't know. Well, I guess the very first awkward conversation that we ever had, we were studying Latin, and we were studying Latin numbers. And, you know, you get to 6, and 6 is sex in Latin. And she said, I'm sexy. And I said, honey, do you know what that means? And she said, yeah, it means I'm cool. And I said, no, it most certainly does not mean you're cool. So it entered into a whole path of understanding the idea of what that means, which we had to, unravel some other understandings of some other things. But at the end of all of that conversation, she had a light bulb moment and said, Mom, what if I said that to a boy at school and I didn't know what it meant, but he did. And I thought I was saying I'm cool, but he thought I was really saying I'm sexy. And I said, exactly. That's why I told you all of that information. So, you know, I think as a parent, when I had kids that were younger, I was terrified that I would miss opportunities. I would miss the big moment to have the talk, or I would miss the big moment to have this talk or whatever. But actually, they have always, I've just followed their lead, you know, and some things you do have to have the conversation before their lead, but it kind of just comes up and you realize, oh, this is the moment. I've just got to take the road. I've got to keep going.
Yeah. And I actually think that successful parenting isn't going to look like having these like sit down lecture type discussions about every single issue. They're going to be the types of conversations that are happening organically and happening daily when you see something on the TV or you see a weird yard sign that has a particular slogan on it, that immediately a question is raised. And in all of this, like there's this good desire with Christian parents to protect the innocence of their children and not to overexpose them to all of these issues too soon. And I want to applaud that instinct. That same instinct, though, I think can lead to kind of this shelter in place mentality to where we want to prolong these conversations and we end up not having them. And so what I would want to say is like lean in 1 degree more than you're probably comfortable with, because it means you need to actually be more intentional. And that internal kind of like, oh gosh, I shouldn't say this, is probably a sign maybe that you should have this conversation, because you do want to protect the innocence of your child. But I would actually say that we need to give our children a higher benefit of the doubt in terms of what they can comprehend and what they can understand. Because guess what? You can try to shelter your kids as much as possible. They're still going to pick up on these things that are happening in the culture. So my mentality is the parents should be the first ones to have those conversations.
So I had an awkward conversation with Hunter today, and I haven't even told John about it. But he said, why are babies purple when they come out? And I said, my first question was, where did you hear about this? And how do you know that they are? And he was like, oh, I was looking at that magazine. It was for a pregnancy center. And I said, okay, so I go into at his level, you know, telling him about it. And then I said, does that answer your question? And then he had more questions. So I went a little bit further. And then, does that answer your question? And then, and then he, was off on Avengers or something. But I think it'd be helpful if we gave some examples of those hard topics. Like, I want John to tell about when the Obergefell decision came down. First of all, people will ask me if I ever get tired of hearing John talk. And I'm like, no, I always take notes when he talks because I just love the way he can lay things out. But this was an instance
on that. That's a good.
Oh, okay. No, but this was one of those instances where I was like, shoot, I wish I had a notebook because the Obergefell decision comes down and our kids are what? 10, 8, and 6 or something like that?
I mean, it was at 2015, right? So, we're about 9 years ago. And so, Abigail would have been just barely 10.
Right.
And I remember thinking at the time, like, I did not have this in my thought to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. But we live in a really, at the time, obviously it's ubiquitous now, but we lived in a, pretty progressive state. And it was like, well, how do we explain this? This is going to be something that's talked about.
What, just for the listeners who may not be familiar with that.
Oh, Obergefell.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Obergefell, the decision that mandated same-sex marriage, on the culture. And you said something a second ago, or in America, Andrew, you said something a second ago I want to come back to, which is giving kids the benefit of the doubt. Part of that is wanting to protect their innocence. But also, I think it's also important. Part of that is to recognize that God has given them a moral instinct, right? The law of God's been written on their hearts, just like it has ours. Now, there are also sinners that suppress that law, like we read in Romans 1. But I saw that in that conversation with Obergefell, and yet this is one of our awkward conversations. Our oldest is 10, and then 8, and then 6, and so we just sat him down and said, "Hey, we want you to know this is something that happened in our nation. And so it's going to change things and you're going to see some stuff." And so we walk through what same-sex marriage was. And I remember our 8-year-old.
Well, say how you described it too.
Oh, I don't remember.
I know, but let's pretend that, I mean, just for the parents out here who are like, what are you actually saying?
Yeah,
like, how are you describing
I think
things?
that's a good question. Well, part of that was kind of reinforcing what is a mommy? What is a daddy? What is a husband? What is a wife? Why, what if there were 2 husbands or 2 wives? So I kind of went about it that way and said, well, that's what our government now has done, is said that a family, a marriage can be 2 husbands and not just a husband and a wife. And just even leaning in, I don't remember, even all the specifics of what I said, but I just remember my 8-year-old just piped up and was like, that's crazy. No one would ever do that. And there was this moral instinct of saying, well, that's not what marriage is. Mm-hmm. That's not what families is. I want to feed that, right? Yeah. I don't want them to second guess it because, they live in a cultural moment where they're going to then, and of course, this is where we're at now, where every episode of every television show has a commercial that portrays 2 daddies or 2 mommies. We have to somehow keep that kind of gut level instinct, moral instinct alive, I think, and the conversations help that.
And John, I think you picked up on something that's really profound, is that our children they're adolescents, they're still learning, but they have that intuitive moral sense that's been the law written on the heart. And what I notice sometimes is that it's children that actually have a better intuitive response to cultural insanity than the adults do. It's the adults that inject complexity and confusion into the conversation with the realms of ideology and various activists that are trying to, teach things that young children's minds and their eyes tell them just isn't the case. Like if you talk to a 5-year-old boy and you ask the 5-year-old boy, "Hey, Sam, can you become a girl?" The 5-year-old boy is going to answer that, absolutely not. And I think the idea that these ideologies get introduced into the culture, the ideologies serve to confuse and complexify. I think that's one of the effects of sin. And I think one of the things that we have to offer in this conversation, and while we do need to have nuance and we need to have sufficient answers, is to understand that the biblical worldview if it is a true worldview, it means it's a worldview that's adjusted to the world that is, and means that it's actually fairly simple, right? It's actually not super complex. So we talk about in the book this idea of the Genesis blueprint. And John, you've probably heard me talk about this. God makes humanity in his image. There's our idea of human dignity. God makes humanity male and female. There's the idea that we come in two forms, male and female, and those can't be changed. And then God makes male and female for one another in the institution of marriage. Now, I haven't used ideas like comprehensive union and complementarity. Those are bigger concepts that like the 16-year-old is going to want to hear about. But the idea that moms and dads, boys and girls are different, moms and dads bring something different to parenting is something that our youngest children can intuitively pick up on. And so I think this should be an encouragement to parents that yes, as bigger questions develop that require bigger answers, we shouldn't run from the fact that the Christian worldview is one that is adjusted to the life that we interact within the world that we know, because the earth is the Lord's, Psalm 24 talks about. And so I think there's a beauty in the simplicity of the Christian worldview. We should lean into that as well.
And most all of the chapters, especially we have, 3 floors. The first floor is for the youngest children, and the second floor about 8 to 12 years old, and the third floor is for the oldest children. But the first and second floors are really looking at what God has said is the basis of whatever that worldview is, from a positive idea of God's plan for the world. So when we look at abortion, we're not telling a 5 and 8-year-old, we're not talking about how murder is bad and killing babies are bad. And no, we're simply talking about how God made life and how God made babies in mommy's bellies and how God made babies to have special, unique features and a plan that he has planned out for their life. So we're talking about God's plan for the world that he planned from Genesis 1 and 2. Yeah. And so I think each and every single cultural craziness can be combated with what did God actually intend for this world to look like? That's what we're teaching the littlest children.
And in the book, what we're trying to do is really begin with some like foundational bedrock principles, because if you understand the bedrock foundational principles and you establish those, you then understand that every cultural crisis that emerges is just the next chapter in the book of cultural chaos, and it's a deviation from those overarching foundational principles, which is why like in the book, we would say that probably the 2 most important chapters are the chapter on human dignity and the chapter on sexuality. And if you understand what the Bible's teaching about human dignity, the value of the human person, and then how we come embodied as male and female, that's going to address the issues of homosexuality, transgenderism, and abortion. And so instead of this being a cultural crisis, oh gosh, we have to respond, but we don't have any good answers, it's, well, no, like what are these key foundational principles that are positively developed in Scripture that provide a framework for us to then evaluate all the other issues that come as the culture continues its descent into chaos.
Okay, so on that sexuality thing, with the framework of kind of what you just laid out, you're in a store and there's transgender guy. Walk us through how I don't even know the right. There is a dude who thinks he's a woman, whatever. But how you turn to your 10-year-old, and do you point it out? Do you hope they don't notice? Kind of walk us through that practically.
So one thing we've been doing as a family is talking about the fact that every human being is made by God and therefore loved by God, and every human being is an image bearer. So that means right out of the gate, we're establishing that people are to be treated respectfully and kindly. And so already our children should know, well, that person may be presenting a little bit oddly, but in the moment, I'm still going to afford that individual respect and kindness. I'm not going to necessarily go out of my way to confront the individual, especially if it's in a random setting in a store. So if we've tilled the ground in advance, the child is going to know, well, that's a human being. Human beings are to be loved. Now, obviously, in this imagined situation, the child's own eyes are probably going to pick up that something seems a bit off. You're probably going to notice the child, their eyes are maybe gawking a little bit. So you might want to have a little bit of an elbow, like, hey, maybe don't stare, perhaps.
Yeah.
But then it's an opportunity immediately walking outside of that store when you get in the car to have that conversation, to say, hey, did you notice something that seemed odd about the person checking us out? And guess what? The child's going to know something that was a little bit off. And that's an invitation to, again, we're not going to use categories like biblical anthropology, the doctrine of sin. But that's an invitation to, why do people think differently than your mom or dad? Why would people think that you can be a woman when you're biologically male? And so that's going to be an invitation to think about the nature of disagreement, the nature of how bad ideas can have consequences. But we're not going to be using heavy categories. But the simple category, depending on the age, though, the simple question would be, do you think that it was a little bit odd that was very obviously a male trying to present as a female? That child is going to say, yeah, that seems a little bit odd. And then you want to allow those conversations to pick up from there. Walking out of a restaurant last year, and a family was walking in, and there was a severely disabled boy in a wheelchair. And we noticed our two younger girls were like, kind of, their attention was captured by this young boy. And we walked outside the restaurant, we got in the car, and I said to the two youngest, I said, hey girls, I noticed that you saw that young boy in a wheelchair, looked a little bit differently. What do you think our attitude should be towards an individual like that? And one of my daughters answered, well, that child was made by God. And so we're called to love that boy. And we should go out of our way to help that boy if he were in need. And like, that's the beauty of I think the innocence of a child. It's the beauty of the simplicity of the Christian worldview. And all of a sudden, that child, the 7-year-old at the time, has this working concept of human dignity in her mind and in her heart, even though she's never heard the concept of human dignity. She's never heard the idea that there are inviolable human rights, inside every human being. Those are those higher level conversations. But if you're intentional in having those conversations on the front end, there really is a payoff on the back end as well.
Yeah. I love the word intentional, and that's what I was thinking about this, kind of on two levels, because I think one of the things about reading the cultural moment we're in is that you don't want, how do I want to say this? You don't want them not to notice things. You know what I mean? Like, I remember we had a moment with the, some folks have heard me tell this story, but the real live action Disney remake of Beauty and the Beast. Do you remember when that came out?
Yep.
Cinderella had come out. It was awesome. My girls were just at that age. They were super excited about it. And then, it was announced that Emma Watson was going to be Belle, and that did it for them. They were like all in. And then a month out, it was like, there's going to be a gay moment in the movie. And they were very proud of it. They announced it. And we were just like, well, what do you do? And, look, I think it would be legitimate, and a lot of parents decided not to go. The other decision would be to go and hope that your kids didn't notice.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that if, I remember when the gay moment came up, I was like, well, there really wasn't much there. But what I didn't want my kids to think is, oh, well, that's normal, right? Because when you don't point it out, then in a cultural moment like ours, things become normalized. And being intentional to have those conversations. And it's not always efficient, is it? Sometimes it's like, all right, we got to put this quick wrap up to the dinner conversation, on hold. We're going to be here a while, it's like, it's really bedtime. We're going to need 30 more minutes. You gotta lean in on that. But that intentionality is really huge. But you said something else, Andrew, that I think is super important. This is really the biggest difference that we have seen between our oldest and our youngest, with that huge kind of 12-year gap, is that you could kind of take things for granted. Like, I mean, not that you should have, but like, look, when our oldest was 7, we weren't having a national conversation about whether, children should be taken out of the homes of parents and given to the professionals so that they could be started on puberty block. Like that was still to some degree an unthinkable idea. Right. And so, but, and you didn't have kind of the, genderless toys and the genderless clothes, and you didn't have kind of the overall conversations happening over and over and over. And part of reading the moment, I think too, is being intentional just to not assume, well, my kid, it was your second biblical blueprint that God made humans male and female. Like no one really questioned that to any degree. Like you could, our teachers didn't have to sit us down and have that conversation with you and me when we were 7 years old, right? Or our parents, because no one was, it was obviously true that there were boys and girls.
Yeah. And
now you kind of actually have to have that conversation intentionally.
Yeah. And this is actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I saw an interesting tweet Friday night that talked about how a lot of what's considered far right or conservative in the United States is considered just normal around the globe. And so it led me to go ask the question, how many nations actually have same-sex marriage? And there's 35 nations out of roughly 195 countries that have same-sex marriage, which tallies out to 18%. Only 18% of the globe has enacted a regime of same-sex marriage, which is an opportunity to tell the kids, like, well, actually, the culture that we're living in is actually the exception from the norm. You've been taught that this is now the norm. When you actually dial out and look at this globally, we're the exception. And by the way, this is one of these reminders that there are a lot of nations around the world that are not populated by Christians. And even the non-Christians have figured out that males and females are different, and that marriage is just like a different type of institution from other types of relationships. And so again, opportunities to run towards those conversations and to affirm the goodness of Scripture and to affirm our love for our neighbor and our love for our culture.
And as we said, if we're not intentionally talking about that, they're watching TV, they're watching movies, they're watching commercials, they're playing video games, and all of that media has dads and moms and all of these same-sex or transgendered people in them that in their mind just make that normal. It's just normalized to them that that's just how the world is, but that's not how the world is. And so we have to be intentionally telling them that this is not the right thing. This is not normal.
And the other thing that I want all of our listeners to hear, like not all of I'll speak for us. Maybe you guys have amazing conversations 24/7 with your kids,
Yes,
but my kids get asked like, oh, I wish I could sit at your dinner table. And Allie the other day was like, so you could try to stop Hunter from making fart jokes? Like, so like, I want our listeners to hear that the heart of this, that it is looking for those opportunities, staying curious together, and seizing on those opportunities. But truthfully, it's not going to happen. It's not like, I don't want everybody to leave this feeling like, wow, my dinner conversations are terrible, because it's just, we're just families living life together. But it's that seeing those moments, and really, I love how you guys talk about just, waiting for looking for the opportunities, actively looking for those opportunities, not letting them go by, hoping maybe when I'm ready, I'll get another opportunity.
Yeah. So 2 things we started doing, though, that have helped us kind of be intentional is that at dinner, we do highs and lows around the table. So it gives everyone a chance to talk about something that's happened during the day, a high and a low. And sometimes those are really good times to catch something that we can expand upon. And then we try to
Try.
have a nightly kind of devotion, if you will. It's not a grand thing, but we have, different bedtimes. So we were going crazy trying to find a time to meet with each other, but we meet at 7:00 in the living room. We have an alarm that goes off in our house at 7. Everybody comes down. We try to read a tiny passage of the Bible. That
not lengthy.
We've got the little one doing somersaults and the big one like, this is so annoying. And, it just is not like perfect.
But it's worth it. Just like it's worth it to fight
and
for.
We pray together and then we sing a song together. And half the time everybody's annoyed that we're singing. But he and I are trying to sing. And so we're trying to do something. And then everybody goes off to whatever they need to do before their actual bedtime. So we're trying to connect and do that. And when you have little kids, it's easy to do bedtime because everybody goes to bed at the same time. But when your kids start to get spaced out, that gets a lot harder. And so we've had to be really creative in doing that. So I would say just keep trying. It doesn't always look like that. And not every night do we get to do it because some nights we have something to do or this one's there and this one's there and it doesn't always work. But
yeah, it seems to me that there's this idea that the ideal Christian family looks like a 17th century Puritan family sitting around stoically reading the Bible. With
Somebody's playing the harpsichord.
Exactly. That couldn't be more far removed from what Christian family life looks like. I'll read a few verses from Ephesians that sometimes are a little bit complex, and you want to ask the question what does that mean? And you get some blank stares. And that's okay.
He reads too long and I'm like, that's too hard. Go back to just one verse. Just break down one verse. It's not seminary.
But I think the important thing is just to build those rhythms to where as our kids leave our home, they find Christian practices having been routine. And those are things that they're going to hopefully replicate in their own lives as they get older as well.
Yeah, and I think, G.K. Chesterton said you can't just grow a beard in a moment of passion, and I think that's true of our formation and our habits. I love that you pointed that out because we are trying to set the rhythm and the pattern that does look different than the world's rhythm and patterns because we have a different end goal. We have a different version of what the good life actually is than the dominant narrative going around in our culture right now. And it is for their flourishing. And so I just think one of the things I'm so glad that I'm so thankful for our church. And I'm so thankful that church is part of that formation in our family. And I cannot emphasize enough because just being in the church all my life, just how formative that is into your imagination, into how you see the world and how you answer those tough questions and the tough moments. And then now to see our kids love the church, it almost makes me pass out. I'm so grateful for it.
And that's one of the things that we talk about in the book is biblical literacy and faithful church membership are absolutely tied to what we're trying to accomplish in this book. Sarah, I love what you just communicated. We can't parent as Christians in this culture apart from having a network of other Christians that are supporting us. We can't be siloed or isolated Christians. That's not going to work in this culture.
Yeah. It doesn't take a village to raise a kid. It takes a church to raise a Christian. I'm quoting some old theologian.
That's a good one.
I know, isn't that good?
I like that.
Yeah, I just didn't want anyone to confuse us with Hillary Clinton.
You should have claimed that as your own. You could have.
I got to remember who it was.
That's the first step because he said someone said. People are going to be like, I think it was John Stone Street.
Yeah, that's right. I did that on purpose.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the topics, obviously we've mentioned some of the topics that you guys cover, which are great. Abortion, really hard one. I know a lot of people, how do I have the conversation about something so bad and so evil with such little kids, and of course the questions around sexuality, we're all tired of talking about that, but we've got to continue because our culture is talking about it literally nonstop all the time and never shuts up. And you talk about gender and you talk about transgender, which I really appreciated because you really modeled there. Look, we're not just talking about what's wrong. We have to talk about what the Bible says, what What does it mean to be human? How did God make us? What we call, you called it the God's creation blueprint. What is actually true and real? And we can't take that stuff for granted. I was a little surprised though by the chapter on politics, and yet at the same time, and so I thought, let's dive into that here, right? Because here we are, it's October, and that's all that's all that anyone's been talking about for a long time, right? And it says a lot about our culture that politics does suck so much air out of the room when, really the really important stuff is what's happening around your table, at your couch, what's happening at church and that sort of stuff. But yeah, maybe two questions. Why politics? Why'd you throw that in that list of topics? And then what are the 2 or 3 takeaways kind of per age group that you guys offer?
So the reason we included that was because the caricature of like conservative evangelicals by the media, by academics, by elite culture is that all we do is spend our day reading the Patriots Bible and watching Fox News. That's kind of the
you don't do that? Is that not your day?
I actually don't. I have my ESV and I read my National Review in the morning.
I watch a lot of Sports Center too, for the records.
But what's really fascinating, and I was speaking somewhere last night, and this was one of the questions. It was, okay, you're calling us to be engaged. What resources should we be reading on a daily basis to be engaged with? And I was just struck by that question because, like, it's a reminder that actually, far from the stereotype and the caricature, I don't think Christians are actually waking up every day politically obsessed. We're moms and dads, husbands and wives, we're employees. And so, in my experience, the average lay Christian in the pew is actually very underinformed at what's happening in the news, and then what's happening at their local and national level with politics. That people would rather watch The Real Housewives or The Bachelor than they would, or The Bachelorette. I don't even know the name of the show, so I'm telling on my own lack of cultural.
There's
both
one
now.
and the other.
Yeah.
So, and there's a golden one now too, which is so weird. I don't even know what. Yeah.
So
they're old.
All we're trying to do in that chapter is to talk about, like, politics is not about raw punditry. It's not preeminently about whether are you of Fox News or are you of MSNBC. It's a question of, God has placed you in this world. How are we going to organize our societies in a way where everyone prospers and can thrive? And guess what? That's called politics. The idea that we have to figure out a way to organize our lives together in a society where there's great disagreements. And so Christians need to be a people that are paying attention to the types of laws that are passed. Laws influence culture, culture influence laws. And all of that is a byproduct of politics, of how we're organizing our life together. And again, I think Christians are actually not paying that much attention to these topics. And so we're trying to take politics out of the realm of punditry and kind of rancor and incivility to a much more like foundational understanding of, like, no, government is actually there for your good. It's established by God to protect justice, to protect the rights of human beings. And so because of that, if it's ordained by God, Christians have an obligation to pay attention to elections. They have a duty to pay attention to the types of laws that your society is passing.
Okay, some big takeaways from the floors. The first floor is really teaching that God is the final authority and that he is over all, even what's happening today, but that he has given us a government, and that government helps care for its people and passes laws to care for our neighbors, and that we are to respect and obey the government, and that we're to care for our neighbors. So that's kind of, we're teaching the little guys, what is a government? How do we care for our neighbors? That's a part of caring for them through the laws that are passed. But ultimately, God is the authority. And then moving into the second floor, we're kind of adding some more understanding, a little deeper understanding of how the government works, and also a little bit broadening the understanding of how laws care for our neighbors, the common good. And now we're adding the next level of disagreement. How do we disagree with each other? And how do we do that kindly and with truth and grace. And then when you get to the third floor, these guys are the ones who are about to leave the nest. These guys are the teenagers. They're going to high school. They're about to go to college. And so we are really teaching them how to actually be involved in local government and why it's important to be involved in local government and how to disagree kindly with each other.
Yeah, and how to develop a political worldview.
And then the moral things that are open-handed. When you look for a party or a political candidate, what are things that you can kind of have open-handedly disagree with but still vote for? But what are closed-fisted things like the right to life and
Marriage,
abortion, marriage, male and female? That's a closed-fisted issue, and that's a moral issue. And you have to find a party or a candidate that that has those same views on moral issues. And then also it ends with, make sure you know where to register to vote when you're 18.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, no, to me, that's so helpful, that sort of intentionality and care, and why you have to have that. I mean, I'm just imagining, right? Like if we don't have those intentional conversations with Hunter at the end of this season, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what has he heard? Like,
Right.
Trump's a bad guy. Oh, Harris is a bad person. Oh, everything is annoying. Oh, this is all terrible. And there's no framework whatsoever of who's in charge and all that sort of stuff. It's you can really see, if we're non-intentional, what they're going to get by osmosis is that everyone's bad and this whole thing's broken and this is just an annoying part of life.
And that breeds cynicism and apathy and disengagement. And that has long-term effects.
I love Morning Wire. It's like the 15-minute, here's the news of the day kind of thing. So the other day he said, what if you could have coffee with Megan Basham? I'm like, what? I never even said that, but she's one of the voices on the Daily Wire or Morning Wire.
He's impressed by whoever's on a podcast.
Yeah.
So, anyway, I that's good. I thought that was super helpful. All right. So listen, we need to wrap things up here. Look, the book is really, really good. I emailed you that and I really mean it. It is really helpful. And parents need that sort of practical thing that you guys, or those practical things that you bring to the book. I love the 3 stories. I think that's really helpful. You can kind of block and tackle. I think it's so important, 2 things, the intentionality and start on that ground floor, lay the foundation. What did God intend with creation? We're not just talking about what Christians believe. We're talking about truth, as Chuck Colson would say, truth with that capital T, and Francis Schaeffer. And, we got to start there as parents. And that is something that we can all do. Thanks for having this conversation with us, and thanks for giving us this resource as parents. And we're real excited about folks hearing about it. By the way, I read it too, and one of the groups we've been working with a lot, surprisingly, is grandparents. And there's such a generational gap, especially between those high schoolers and grandparents on worldview issues. That if grandparents are trying to figure out how to have great conversations, this is a great resource for you as well. So pick up a copy, and we're pleased this month at the Colson Center to provide a copy to anyone who gives a gift of any amount to the Colson Center. And it's just such a terrific resource. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, John. I really appreciate it.